They never did find a body, or at least not a whole one. For the longest time, it seemed like the police officers and detectives in charge of the scene didn't want to share anything with John. Though to be fair, I can't blame them. When the crime scene report contains words like pieces, chunks, and meat in reference to someone's son, it isn't the easiest conversation to have, is it? I understood their reluctance, particularly because I didn't want to talk to John about it either. We had been friends for years. His son and my daughter were the same age and attended the same school. John and his wife had been over to our house many times, and the two kids were firm friends. They were... That past tense really stings. My reasons for not wanting to discuss the death of John's son were not the same as the ones the police had. Obviously, standing there in his son's room, looking at the shredded linen of his bedclothes, the smashed furniture and the blood, the streaks and pools of red all around the room, there was very little that I could say. But that wasn't the point. The point was that I should have said something sooner. For the police, their reluctance was about not wanting to upset John by sharing information from after the event. After the murder, I avoided talking to him for the opposite reason, because I was worried that I had information before the event. Information that perhaps I should have shared, and which might, if I'd been quicker off the mark, have stopped his little Danny, his boy, his son, from being torn to pieces. Still, it probably wouldn't have done any good. If I had told him, he probably wouldn't have believed me anyway. Christ, I hardly believed it myself. Even though it was so clearly and horribly true, most people won't believe it. But I still have to try. Livy first started talking about someone called Egbert when she was around 6. She had been at school for a few months by that point, so I just assumed that it was one of the other kids at the school she was talking about. It was only when she started asking if we could lay a place for him at the table that I realized that Egbert was what people refer to as an imaginary friend, a character she had created, and she was playing pretend she could see. I remember going into her room to read her a bedtime story and seeing her squashed right over to the left-hand side of the bed rather than the middle where she would usually be. I asked her what she was doing, and she said that she needed to leave space in the bed in case Egbert wanted to get in later. I'll be honest and say that even at that point, the thought of it kind of creeped me out. The crayon drawings that Livy did of Egbert were not nice. They showed what looked to me like a cross between a boy and some kind of amphibian or reptile, like a gecko or a frog. The head was far too large for the body and made this squat, hunched little character look like one of those vinyl Funko Pop dolls that people collect. The eyes were completely black and looked both huge and almost circular, their color matched by the crop of scruffy spiked black hair on top of the head and also by the teeth. What was weird to me was that none of the other figures Livy drew even had teeth. The mouths on her drawings of me, her mother, or herself, even next door's dog Bess, all had straight lines or crescent-shaped smiles to depict the mouth. Egbert had teeth, a row of small black triangles that stretched all the way from one side of his massive head to the other. They were not just outlined black, but colored in, so that they looked like small black pyramids. It was this image that came to mind when Livy talked about her friend climbing into her bed, and the thought of it made me feel a bit ill. I wondered, even as I read her the bedtime story, what I might do if I was to come into the room later and find not one but 2 bodies huddled under the covers. If, on the pillow next to my daughter, this hunched, gray-faced goblin with its thin, spindly limbs and small black teeth were in bed beside her, its arms wrapped around her. Obviously, I didn't mention this to Livy because for her, the relationship with Egbert was just a game. Pure, completely innocent, and harmless. Or so I thought. It was only when I started finding the food that I realized there had been a weird turn in Livy's little game. It was my wife who mentioned it first. Over the course of a few days, she had found crumbs, partially eaten biscuits, the crust of a sandwich, and the stone from a peach at the bottom of Livy's bed. Initially, she thought that Livy was taking food into the bedroom with her and told her not to. "If you're going to eat stuff, darling, then you can do it in the living room or at the table with Mummy and Daddy," she had said, and assumed naturally that this was the end of it. But it wasn't. Over the next few weeks, we caught Livy, on several occasions, slipping biscuits or bits of her dinner into her pockets, as if she was saving them later for some midnight snack. Sure enough, every few days, we would find half-eaten bits of food at the end of the bed or under it. Sometimes it was even on a small dish that Livy had somehow managed to smuggle upstairs. We again told her to knock it off and that she shouldn't be taking food up to the bedrooms, but it still happened several more times. There was a part of me that thought it was harmless. If she wanted to have little midnight feasts and enjoy snacking away in her secret little world, then fine. But obviously, there were other concerns. What damage would it do to her teeth if she was snacking at night after brushing? What danger was there that she could choke if unsupervised? Plus, there was the issue of just leaving bits of food around the place. After a while, it occurred to me that she wasn't just snacking at night. We had not set a place at the table for Egbert, so this was her response. She thought she was sharing with her imaginary friend. The night I actually met Egbert was our last night in that house. I had gone up the stairs again to read her a story, but had stopped at the end of the landing when I heard her talking, whispering very quietly to someone in the room. I stood there in the darkness of the landing with Livy's room at the end, lit up by the small pink nightlight, and listened. She was saying something about the food, how she was getting in trouble for bringing it up, and how she would need to stop. Obviously, hearing that and the idea that she was rehearsing and going over the fact that she had been in trouble gave me a small stab of guilt, and I took a few steps toward the room. All of a sudden, though, I stopped in my tracks because someone answered back. It was a small, croaky voice, the sort of voice you might expect to come out of an elderly person who had smoked heavily their entire life. A deep, rattling croak that sounded like it would have come from some gigantic toad or a cockroach, not my beautiful daughter. So deep and strangled was the voice that I had a hard time believing that Livy could have made it, especially when she began speaking again, and the two voices seemed to overlap. How could she, I wondered, be producing the two voices at the same time? I stepped a little closer, hoping to quietly stick my head around the door and see her there playing alone. As I approached, however, I heard the tone of the conversation shift. The croaky voice, though still indistinct so that I couldn't make out individual words, had become more forceful, louder, and even, I might say, a little aggressive. Hurrying forward, I took a final large step and stuck my head around the door. It was then that I saw, just for a second, that Livy was not talking to herself at all. She was not alone. What I saw firsthand was just a blur, a black hobbling shape that seemed to be there one moment and gone the next, like a flash of something almost glimpsed from the corner of the eye. Where I saw more clearly was in the mirror. Within a second, I had swept Livy up into my arms and was hurtling down the stairs, screaming to my wife to drop what she was doing and get out. In the car outside, I questioned Livy sternly and loudly about who she had been talking to. Livy began to cry. She told us that she had been talking to Egbert, that he had been mean to her. For weeks he had been demanding that she bring him food, biscuits, sandwiches, anything she could, and leave it at the end of the bed. "I have to give him food, Daddy," she said, her eyes wild and terrified. "'Cause if I don't, he says he'll eat me. He says he'll pull me up the chimney and take me away to eat me." I never went back to that house after dark. The following day I contacted an estate agent. Within a few days, the house was on the market, and within a month we had moved. In the interim, we stayed in a hotel. It was only for a second, but in that instant, in the mirror, I saw him. The gray-faced little man with big black eyes, the scruffy dark hair and those black, jagged teeth. My daughter's so-called friend was far from imaginary. That night was the last time that Livy mentioned Egbert for over a month. The next time she did mention him, it was to say that he too had moved. She had been playing with her paints and, apropos of nothing, said that, "I don't see Egbert now. He's at Danny's house." I swear that when she said that, I was actually relieved. Even though I had seen what I'd seen, or at least thought I had, I assumed that this, for her at least, was closure. By pretending that Egbert had moved house the same way she had, she was ruling off under the character, and that would be the last we heard. 2 weeks later, I heard from John. The call said that someone had broken into Danny's room. He did not say on the phone that the same someone had broken Danny as well. Standing in that room beside John, I looked around at the carnage. I saw the blood, the mess, and the damage. But I also saw the small plate with half-chewed biscuits and chicken bones laying at the end of what had been Danny's bed. I saw the drawings pinned to his notice board and a strange, dark-eyed character staring out from amongst them. I knew that nothing I said would help John. It was too late to warn him. But I could perhaps warn others. At the school both Livy and Danny attended, the parents have a WhatsApp group, a group that I am a member of. Using an anonymous number, I managed, after several attempts, to get into that group and post warnings to the other parents, telling them to keep an eye out for imaginary friends, for a character named Egbert, and for habits like hiding food. At first, the response was predictably hostile, with mothers wanting to know who I was and how I'd gotten the group's number. Some called me awful names and accused me of scaremongering. But 4 parents, 4 mothers in 4 separate households, messaged my account privately to ask what could be done. Their kids all had an imaginary friend. In every case, it had the exact same name, and in every case, it was hungry.